talk about our guest author. So we have Bonnie Rochman. She's a graduate of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She's a Seattle local currently and an award-winning health and science writer. Her work has appeared in Time Magazine, Time.com, that's the Oprah Magazine, Parenting, Babble, XX, Slate, Cookie, and the News and Observer. She's here today to talk about her first book, which came out 1 week ago. It's The Gene Machine, how genetic technologies are transforming parenting and reshaping our society. And in this book, she explores the cutting edge of gene technology and how it is transforming medicine, bioethics, healthcare, and the factors that shape our families. So let's welcome Ms. Bonnie Rochman. Or Rochman, sorry.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. I want to let you know if you're worrying, this doesn't really have that much to do with my particular line of work. Yes, it does. At its heart, this is really a story about data. And I know that speaks to you. So I'm going to start by telling you how this book came about, which requires me to pull up this questionable graduation picture from 1994 when I graduated from UNC. It was the bicentennial. UNC happens to be the nation's oldest public university. And we were fully expecting a really impressive speaker. So other classes had gotten Madeleine Albright, Desmond Tutu, John Grisham. And we heard we were getting a guy named Francis Collins. No one knew who he was at the time, although I see a nod there. At the time, he was director of the National Human Genome Research Institute. What? No one knew what that was either. So his job was to try to articulate all 3 billion base pairs that are part of our genome, our genetic code. And I have to say, it seemed incredibly remote. Nevertheless, Francis did a bang-up job. He gave a great speech. We all went out into the world. And he did such a good job that in 2009, 15 years after graduation, he was actually appointed head of the National Institutes of Health, or NIH, which is our country's medical research agency. That was the same year that I started working at Time Magazine, and I was a health and parenting columnist. This was my column. It was called Family Matters, and I could write about pretty much anything I wanted as long as it intersected with health and parenting. So that means I got to write about Beyonce and her promotion of public breastfeeding and how friends influence other friends' decision to vaccinate or not to vaccinate their children. And I found that left to my own devices, I actually wrote quite a bit about genetics. So I wrote about some pretty questionable companies that were marketing tests to kind of determine your child's aptitude for a particular sport, kind of based on their genes, what they would be particularly good at if you want to sort of steer them in a direction of a particular sport. And I wrote about parents' decisions to share or not to share their genetic testing results with their children. And I had been doing this job for about 6 months when this study up there landed in my inbox. And I remember this very well because I was on a plane with my family en route to a family vacation. And my kids, who were 3, 6, and 8 at the time, I remember looking over at them. They were all seated in one row and thinking, would I want to know this level of data, this depth of information about my kids? So what this study was about, the level of the information that this study was looking to find out, had to do with a group of parents who had genetic testing. And the parents were then asked hypothetically if they would want to test their kids under the age of 18 for some very common adult onset disorders, things like diabetes, like skin cancer, like high cholesterol or high blood pressure. And the parents pretty much uniformly across the board said, yeah, totally, bring it on. This is gonna be amazing. We're gonna get the clean bill of health. We're gonna feel like our kids are super healthy, and we'll move on. So what they didn't realize was that these mutations are so common that on average, each kid would have about 9. Now, not to say they would definitely get the disease, but they were at increased risk for developing this disease later on. So what was striking to me is that people did not understand the connection between genes heredity, disease, increased risk. So they were doing this testing because they thought they would just rule things out and feel really good. And instead, what they were going to do is find information that was not particularly definitive, but kind of raised more questions, and in some cases could actually raise more anxiety. So that made me realize that genes are not black and white, that in some cases, there's suggestions about what will happen down the road, and in some cases, there's certainty, but it's not very cut and dried. And so there's this misconception, really, that genes are destiny. But in truth, it's really just part of the puzzle. So I was so interested in these findings that genes are not always destiny, that you really can't know, that I decided to look into it more. So this multidimensional aspect of DNA, of genes, of heredity, led me to pitch a story to my editor at Time about the implications of sequencing children's genomes, of reading their entire genetic code. And about getting all this data, these huge quantities of information about your kids, some of which will be deterministic, others, some of the information we won't even really know what it means, and is that a good idea? So it ended up being a series, a week-long online series, and then that morphed into a cover story, the last cover story of 2012, which you see up on the screen. And when you spend a ton of time on a big project, you never want to hear another word about it, or you're even more intrigued. So for me, it was the latter, and I decided to go ahead and write a book about this world in which we have more access than ever to cutting-edge technology, to peer inside our genomes, and to emerge with a snapshot of disease, both potential and actual. And I wanted to do this by telling the stories of real people. So speaking of stories of real people, you may recognize this guy up there on the screen. So several years ago, Sergey Brin did a 23andMe gene panel, and he learned that he has got a pretty rare genetic mutation that predisposes him to develop Parkinson's. So I looked up his blog from when he got his test results, and he says that when he had done the genetic testing, he, quote, viewed it mostly as entertainment. And yet, what happened is he ended up finding this gene mutation that actually means he has a significantly elevated risk of developing Parkinson's disease. Now, some people in his situation might feel very freaked out about that, depending on what their impressions are and what their relationship is with data, especially personal genetic data. But Sergey, on the other hand, he said this in his blog. He said, "I feel fortunate to be in this position. Until the fountain of youth is discovered, all of us will have some conditions in our old age, only we don't know what they will be. I have a better guess than almost anyone else for what ills may be mine, and I have decades to prepare for it." So that made me think back to that study that I, originally set me off on this entire journey. And it's really interesting what Sergey says, because he actually goes on in his blog to give specific examples of how he might change his life due to learning about this genetic mutation and the predisposition to Parkinson's. So there's some research showing that exercise may be protective against the development of Parkinson's. So I can only imagine that he has become a gym rat. He can also direct his money to help support research into causes of Parkinson's, treatments for Parkinson's. So I think that his experience is really illustrative of how genetic data, even if it is not a certainty, really allows you to take control of your life. This is Gracie. She has Down syndrome. I'll tell you a little bit more about Gracie in a second. One way that all this access to new genetic technology and data is really changing our world is that it's redefining the holy grail concept of what it means to be or to have a healthy baby. So when you get pregnant, oftentimes if you ask people, "Oh, are you having a girl or a boy?" Sometimes they have a preference, but sometimes they'll just say, I don't care. I just want a healthy baby. So what exactly is a healthy baby? We have this constantly expanding array of genetic technologies that offer insight prenatally into a baby's health. But what does it mean to be healthy? For example, a baby born with Down syndrome, about half of the time they have heart defects that need surgical repair, but about half of the time they don't, and they can just go home from the hospital. So is a baby with Down syndrome a healthy baby? Up for debate. So, when I was born, my mom didn't know if I had Down syndrome. She didn't even know what gender I was. And today, already in the first trimester, there are blood tests that can detect Down syndrome in a non-invasive way, which is really reshaping a lot of the debate around disability and the perception of who should and should not be born in our society. So back to Gracie. She's in Boston. She lives in Boston, right outside, and she likes lip syncing to Taylor Swift. I visited her 2 years ago, and she lip synced Macklemore's Thrift Shop for me. She is funny. She is a diligent learner. She is doing really well in school thanks to her mom's advocacy. So she's in inclusion classes, and she's also really charmingly irreverent. One of the funniest stories in the book is Gracie's mom telling me about Gracie's trip to the dentist. So Gracie, the dentist was trying to butter her up and said to Gracie, "Oh, you're so cute. Can you open your mouth for me?" And Gracie responded, "Get away from me, you," word that rhymes with witch. So a friend of Gracie's mom joked that Gracie was really just saying what everyone else is thinking anyway. So there's now new research to improve the lives of people who have Down syndrome. There's research into silencing the extra copy of the 21st chromosome that characterizes this condition. There's research into drugs that can be taken prenatally by a pregnant mom, or drugs that can be taken after birth by a child with Down syndrome. And as you might imagine, some parents are really excited about this, and some parents are super conflicted. And for Melanie, Gracie's mom, like any parent, how many of you have kids? Okay, so, and even for those of you who don't have kids, you can imagine, think back to your parents. Everyone always wants the best for their child. They want their child to have every single opportunity. Yet that really raises the question of what does it mean to have every opportunity? Are drugs actually changing the essence of the child versus helping them to achieve their potential? So let's do a quick poll. I'm going to ask you if it's good, bad, or inconsequential to have a baby who's born blind or missing a limb or with some sort of intellectual disability. Raise your hand if you think that's a good thing. What about bad? Inconsequential? Doesn't matter at all? So that's pretty standard. I've never had anyone say it's a good thing. Most people say it's a bad thing, and usually a couple of people say it's inconsequential. It doesn't really matter one way or another. And I interview a professor of law in the book who researches eugenics, which is the practice of trying to build a superior race, and that is now out of favor in this country. It reached its height during the Nazi era, but it did go on in the United States for many, many, many years. And this professor, Paul Lombardo, he posits that if he would do a survey of most people whom he considers compassionate and not mean-spirited, that most people would say there are actually some conditions the baby should not be born with if there is a way to avoid it. I found that really powerful because, we as a society in general, we think that we are open-minded, open-hearted, and yet when it comes right down to it, if you're asked about disability and you have the option to opt out of it, most people say no thanks in that sort of situation. So I spoke with a mom whose son has something called 22q deletion, which is which is a condition in which her son is missing a small part of his 22nd chromosome. And it's accompanied by mild to moderate intellectual disability. There can be heart defects. So this boy in particular was doing amazingly well when I interviewed his mom. He was in a 4-year university. He was living 3 hours away from home. And still, this mom was terrified of the possibility that her son would give birth to a child like him. So every year when her son, who was I think around 20 at the time, would go for a checkup with his geneticist, this mom would beseech the geneticist to say, you have to tell him that he has to use birth control. So here you have this mom who loves her son and who's really proud of his accomplishments and his achievements, but she's saying, oh my God, don't have a kid like you. So people with 22q have a 50% chance of passing that on to their children. And this mom is saying, please don't give me a grandchild like you. Don't give me a grandchild like you. So you can imagine what kind of delicate ethical tightrope that is to be perched on. You can actually avoid 22q through something called preimplantation genetic diagnosis. This is a picture up here of an embryo, and a couple cells are being siphoned out of the embryo. The embryo is just a few days old, probably about 5 days old. And then those cells are analyzed to determine whether there is the presence or absence of a particular genetic mutation. And so the way that it is currently used right now is it's employed in most cases to get rid of very severe, often fatal childhood diseases, something like Tay-Sachs, which is often fatal before a child would reach kindergarten. So you take these embryos. So it's very different from something like gene editing. You probably have all heard of something called CRISPR, which is a way to edit genes. So this is not editing genes. Instead, this is taking embryos, looking at them, and saying, oh, that one has Tay-Sachs. Okay, let's discard that, or let's throw that, let's put that aside. And this one doesn't have Tay-Sachs, let's implant that one into a woman's uterus. So you are picking and choosing, and you're selecting in favor of not having a particular disease. So what's different, again, going back to CRISPR? CRISPR obviously raises concerns of what, in the media we talk about designer babies. What does that really mean? Well, the truth is that we don't know currently how to build a future Google engineer or manufacture the next Michael Jordan or the next Yo-Yo Ma. And the reason is because there's not one single gene that codes for a killer jump shot or amazing ability as a cellist or as a programmer. It's a confluence of influences from your environment, where you live, who your parents are, your exposure to all sorts of things, plus your genetic makeup. So PGD is often, preimplantation genetic diagnosis, is not as you might imagine, it is not as ethically fraught as something using CRISPR technology to edit genes, to edit embryos. And it's been used for decades to avoid transmitting these serious diseases, such as Tay-Sachs that I mentioned. But it's also now increasingly being considered for diseases that are not necessarily fatal. So most people in this room probably know someone who's been diagnosed with breast cancer. And you can select an embryo that does not have a breast cancer mutation. So if that BRCA1 or BRCA2 mutation runs in your family, or a whole host of other breast cancer mutations, BRCA1 and 2 are just the most common. So if those run in your family and you want to kind of stop that train and say, I don't want to transmit, this has been hell in my family. My mom died, my aunt died. I was diagnosed when I was, in my 20s, and I don't want to pass this legacy on to my child. You can do a preimplantation genetic diagnosis to have a child who has not inherited your genetic mutation. So that raises the question of, are we playing God by doing something like this? Breast cancer is very different from Tay-Sachs. Having a genetic mutation that predisposes you to breast cancer just means that you're at increased risk for it. It's like Sergey and his Parkinson's. He won't necessarily get it. It means he's at elevated risk for it. So knowing that an embryo is at elevated risk for a disease, is it ethical to not have that child, to not bring that child into the world because of a possibility of a disease that may develop decades down the road? Now let's change the scenario even a little bit more. Let's say you are completely opposed to doing something like that, to using pre-implantation genetic diagnosis and that data to weed out certain embryos. But let's say you have a breast cancer mutation in your family and you have a baby. Do you then think that you have the right to data to know whether your child has inherited your genetic mutation? So pediatric ethics guidelines say no, you don't. You don't have the right to know, you don't have the right to test your child under the age of 18 unless it's medically necessary. And something like knowing about a risk for breast cancer would not be considered medically necessary for a 3-month-old. So I'm gonna read to you a little bit from the book of even something like this, how complicated it can be. So the first little bit I'm gonna read to you is from a doctor named Mike Baumschad. He is the head of pediatric genetic medicine at UW. And he says, we are recommending that parents be left with the ambiguity that their infant is a higher risk for breast cancer because they have breast cancer in their family, but we're unwilling to test the baby to know for sure. He disagrees with that. And he says, if we're counseling someone in clinic and they're at high risk for breast cancer and they have their infant daughter with them, why in the world would we wait to talk again until she's 18? Why would we not test and say she's not a BRCA carrier, or she is, and here's what you should do about it? We should use this information, this data, to improve healthcare. And one of the clearest ways to improve healthcare is to prevent disease. It's very clear cut. So I find that incredibly persuasive. And then I'm going to read to you a passage from a woman who became my friend after I interviewed her. She was diagnosed with breast cancer at age 32. Her mom died when she was very young, and she has a BRCA mutation. So this is Debbie. Right after she found out via ultrasound that she was having a daughter, I came out saying, oh my God, what if she gets breast cancer? Her husband, Evan, did not understand. He calls me doom and gloom. But I said, I'm going to die if she gets breast cancer. Debbie was determined to find a way to test her daughter Jordan, but her husband was adamantly opposed. And now she agrees with him. I don't think it's fair for us to have that information and have that heaviness in our family or in how we relate to Jordan. I think knowing whether Jordan is positive or negative would also cause a lot of tension and sadness in our family. When you think about testing a child, you have to think of the ramifications that it would have on lots of family members. So you can see two very well-reasoned, yet extremely different perspectives on the value and the appropriateness of information. It's really super complicated. As the technology evolves, these ethical dilemmas are coming at us fast and furious. I'm not a scientist. I like to think of myself as a humanist, and I wrote this book because I'm really fascinated by these questions of right or wrong and red lines. Are there red lines? If there are red lines, where are they? Who decides? And nowhere is this more heated than when it comes to making babies. Again, we have to just keep asking ourselves the question, and as Googlers, I'm sure you can appreciate this, is there such a thing as too much information? So these are all really big ideas. I don't give yes or no answers because I don't believe there are none. I think these decisions are all extremely personal. They're individual. And it really comes down to choice and what's right for you and your comfort with a great degree of information and data. So if you're sick of small talk at your next party, you can try these topics on for size. Do parents have a right to all of their child's health data? So some experts believe that within a couple of years, we're going to have our genome in the cloud. So if parents, if that does come to pass, should parents know everything there is to know about a child's DNA? And let's say that there's a problem. Would you love your kid less or maybe even more? Now back to that BRCA mutation. Say your newborn has her genome sequenced and a BRCA mutation is discovered. A couple minutes ago I told you that, pediatric ethics guidelines say that we don't test kids under 18 for something that's not medically necessary and needs to be dealt with right now. But it's really likely that that baby has inherited her genetic mutation from her mom or her dad. And let's say those parents don't know that they have the mutation. So by telling them, you then are enabling them to take whatever measures they feel are appropriate. A mom could have a prophylactic mastectomy. A dad could, men obviously get breast cancer as well. They're also at greater risk for prostate cancer. So you're just basically enabling them to be more empowered regarding their own health. And, it's really complicated because you think that you're not supposed to tell the parents because you're sort of encroaching upon the child's right of privacy and protecting her own genetic data. And yet, telling the parents that the child has a mutation could actually be a clear way to do something really amazing for that child by potentially averting the death of one of her parents. So, in short, it used to be a lot easier to be pregnant. As I said, my mom did not even know if I was a boy or a girl when I was born, and today we have tons and tons of genetic data. We often, I won't say often, but regularly, as the tests get more sophisticated, we'll find out information that is completely unclear. And you have to then decide, do you proceed with this pregnancy based on really uncertain information? I spin the stories of several families who got really disconcerting information, like their baby was missing a couple genes or some DNA was duplicated, and what exactly does that mean? And how do you proceed with that? In some of these cases, the parents learned that they actually had the same deletions or genetic duplications. And then it's pretty mind-blowing. You have to figure out how to process all of that. So I'm gonna end with the best compliment that I received about this book, which is going to entail me telling you a little bit about the book building process and these impressive blurbs that appear on the back. I feel like Vanna White up here. Those blurbs don't just appear there. It's not like someone goes into a bookstore, reads my book, and is just so incredibly moved that they contact my publisher and say, I've got to write some words of praise for the back of that lady's jacket. No, instead, it's this very arduous process of reaching out to, so I convened with my editor and we kind of developed a list of really influential people who would be amazing to blurb the back of the book. And then it's this very humiliating process of reaching out via email and basically begging these people who are already incredibly busy to please read your book. And if they're so inclined and if they like it, maybe they'll write a couple pithy words for you to stick on the jacket. So one of these women, Kelly Benham French, had just written her own book, a really beautiful memoir about the birth of her extremely premature daughter. The book is called Juniper. And she had agreed to receive a copy of the book. And so I followed up for the first time on October 26th by writing to her and saying, hey, just checking in, trying to remain all casual. And she responded, just got the book and haven't looked at it yet, but I'm looking forward to it. So I wrote back, ugh, isn't this blurb seeking just the worst? I appreciate your making the effort, Kelly. And the next day she wrote back, the whole book promotion thing, ugh, standing naked on the street corner would be more fun. So I decided I was gonna up the ante here. More like standing naked on the street corner in sub-zero temps in Times Square, that would only begin to capture the horror. And then she went radio silent on me after I bared my soul. So I decided to check in after a week. Hello, fellow naked street corner dweller. I'm gritting my teeth and oh so casually checking in to see if you just might be inclined to blurb this book of mine. Time dragged by. There was no word. And then finally, I got an email from her. 10 words total. This book doesn't suck. Thank God. That would have been awkward. I laughed and I wrote back to her, that is the blurb right there. This book doesn't suck. And then she responded. You can see we had a great email correspondence going. And she really had the last word. She wrote, really, that's all any of us can ever hope for. So I find that it wasn't just about my book. That's really a universal truth. So I hope you enjoyed hearing about the book, and I hope you find it interesting. I hope it makes you think about things that you hadn't really considered before, about science and babies, and how these two things intersect in ways both marvelous and mysterious. And thank you so much for coming. I'm happy to take any questions.
Yeah, so, I mean, we can debate the ethics and have a lot of philosophical arguments, but at the end, either a technology will work or it won't, right? So, you know, when little Johnny goes to school, if little Alice, who had genetic modification, is better than him in everything, then when Johnny has a brother or a sister, if the parents can afford it, they're going to do it, right?
Well, not speaking for for Johnny's parents, but the important thing to note is that currently we don't know how to make so-called designer babies. In fact, in the book, I talk about, well, in some ways, we're actually already creating designer babies. If anyone here has had a child via IVF or knows someone who has, and it's everywhere now, those babies could actually technically be considered designer babies. So if you're choosing donor sperm, you go through this entire checklist. You can learn where the donor went to school, what the donor's job is, what the donor's personality is like. You can access baby pictures. You know, it's basically like this whole smorgasbord of traits there. You know, the donor has a quick temper, the donor has an amazing sense of humor, and you can select all these things. But you know, so I think it can be argued that already we're doing that in, you know, people who have who go through assisted reproduction. But if you're just having sex the regular way, the way that we've done for centuries, we just don't. You can't. You know, it's luck of the draw. And even if you then apply technologies through assisted reproduction, we don't know how to make the next Einstein. So it's a whole, you know, it's kind of someone could crack the code, then I think that your question would be a lot more valid. But currently, we don't know. There's not the intelligence gene and the awesome on the football field, you know, Seattle Seahawks gene. So it's just not, it's not possible at this point in time. It's really focused more on disease and elimination of disease.
Well, thank you very much for telling us about your book that doesn't suck.
Thank you.